Well, the Prime Minister is talking about, I wouldn't quite say threatening, but talking about a double dissolution election trigger. That's if the signature housing bill is not passed this week. Standing in the way at the moment, the Greens. Well, MP and housing spokesperson Max Chandler-Mather joins me now in the studio. Thanks for your time. Are you negotiating? Have there been talks today? Is this ongoing or is it a stalemate?
Well, look, we're disappointed that the government is going around threatening early elections and I would argue not taking this housing crisis very seriously. We do still want to negotiate on the Housing Australia Future Fund bill. The bottom line is the current plan will see the housing crisis get worse because the shortage of social and affordable housing, now 750k homes, will increase under the Labor's plan because they only want to build 30,000 homes at most and do nothing for renters over 5 years. And we don't want to lock in a plan that locks in failure over 5 years. We've said to the government first, we'd like $5 billion a year for public and affordable housing and a rent freeze. We halved our offer to $2.5 billion. We're willing to shift again, but it also takes two to tango.
Willing to shift again to what?
Well, look, I'm not going to negotiate live on air.
But is it on the amount or is it something else? What are you...
Well, look, what we've said to the government is they have a $20 billion budget surplus, $20 billion. Now, I think it's reasonable in that context to think about spending, we've said, $2.5 billion a year on public and affordable housing. Also, in the context of the worst rental crisis we've seen now in generations, we do need to find a way to cap or freeze rent increases. And on that, the Prime Minister does have the power to help coordinate that with National Cabinet, the body he chairs, currently considering a plan for national rent.
A bit to step through there, but just on the amount, would you perhaps be willing to look at something in which the fund itself stays the same, but there's an injection, a one-off injection from that $20 billion? Is that what you've put on the table?
Well, look, what we have said is that, for instance, we would be the Social Housing Accelerator, for instance, which we secured, that one-off $2 billion fund. For instance, we would be willing to negotiate a plan where the HAF stays as is, but we do negotiate ongoing $2.5 billion a year out of the Social Housing Accelerator.
But that's you're saying that comes out of the surplus. That surplus is a one-off. We're going to go back into a negative budget situation. So the government's not going to budge on that, is it? It doesn't sound like you're willing to go for a one-off figure. You want something extra guaranteed annually.
Well, of course, this is our one. The government doesn't have a majority in the Senate. They've said the Housing Australia Future Fund is their long-term housing plan. It's reasonable that at our one time where we have a chance to change it, that we change it in a way that secures some additional ongoing funding. Because to be frank, at most $500 million a year, at most, by the way, from 2024-25, is not even a drop in the ocean given the scale of the housing crisis. And so we think it's reasonable, also when they're locking in $30 billion a year with the stage 3 tax cuts, that they spend $2.5 billion a year on public and affordable housing. We're willing to negotiate how that looks. We're willing to even negotiate on the number. But rather than just threatening early elections, I think the government should come to the table.
But you want more annual has to be part of it from the current figure. When you say negotiating, have things broken down? When was your last genuine discussion with Labor on this?
Well, look, I think it's pretty clear recently the government isn't behaving necessarily like a good negotiating partner, and that to us is disappointing. I mean, we've been out there halving our offer from $5 billion to $2.5 billion. We've also said that while we want a 2-year freeze on rent increases and caps on rents after that, bottom line, we'd like unlimited.
We'll get to that in a sec, but just your last discussion, when was the last time you sat
look, I'm not
down?
going to reveal the particular meeting times, but I would...
A day ago, a week ago. I'm just saying, is it ongoing or is it's sort of, no one's talking right now?
Well, look, we'll be attempting to meet this week, but I think our general view is that the government at the moment is behaving as if it's their way or the highway. And when that's
your view, but are you saying that because the government has now said, this is it, take it or leave it, and they don't want any more negotiation? Is that what's happening?
Well, I think that's a question for the government, not for me.
Well, I'm asking you because they would have communicated that to you in the party.
I suppose what I would say is I think it's disappointing in the way that they're acting over the last few days because threatening and that they are saying, that they seem to be indicating they would rather force Australia back to an early election rather than spend a few extra $1 billion on public and affordable housing and do something for renters is a pretty remarkable position for a government to take when they don't have a majority in the Senate.
From that, though, I'm deducing that they've said no more negotiation. Is that what they've said to you at the moment?
No, although I would argue that they're behaving like that at the moment, but I don't want to reveal, obviously, private discussions that we're having with the government.
So is there a bit of a difference between what they're saying publicly and privately? Is that fair to say?
Look, I'm not going to talk about private
Why not?
conversations.
Well, I'm not saying reveal the conversation, but publicly, our perception is they're saying no dice, take it or leave it. You're saying privately there is perhaps some ground still being worked on.
Well, look, our intention, and again, that's really a question for the government. That is really a question for the government. Our intention is we get to October and we negotiate a plan that starts to tackle the scale of the housing.
Well, it's a question for the government if I get them in here. We're trying on the housing minister, but I'm just asking you, do you feel like the door's still open at the moment?
Well, I hope you get the housing minister on. And I think our point is that there's two key negotiating points that we hope to shift in October. One, they've said at most $500 million a year. We started with $5 billion. We halved it to $2.5 billion. They still have not shifted off $500 million a year. And our next key item is something for the 1/3 of this country who rents.
So what about rent, though? This is a state responsibility. What are you saying the federal government should do here exactly?
Well, no, that's not necessarily true. Firstly, last year, the federal government coordinated through National Cabinet a plan to cap energy prices, the specifics of which involved state legislation. During the pandemic...
But ultimately, the states would have to agree to it. So
sure,
it's
but
not
that's...
something the federal government can just do of its own accord.
Well, the federal government has a powerful role because it holds the purse strings and it coordinates national action all the time. And what we know right now, there's two key things. One, National Cabinet are currently discussing a plan to harmonise national renters' rights. Two, all but one seat on that National Cabinet are held by members of the Labor Party. Is the Prime Minister seriously expecting us to expect that he can't go there and coordinate something for renters?
Well, you say coordinate, but Victoria are doing it, Queensland are doing it, New South Wales don't want to. That's just the reality. You can say coordinate all you want. It doesn't mean New South Wales will change its mind.
It can if the federal government goes to National Cabinet and puts real money on the table. Are you telling me that a Premier would go back to their state and say, well, the federal government has put $1 billion on the table, but we're going to turn that down because we're so opposed to limiting rent increases?
Why are they just putting $1 billion on the table? What are they doing?
Well, that's our proposal, that the federal government, in the same way, so for instance, during the energy price cap, the federal government made a contribution to the states. For health and education regulation, the federal government puts money on the table and uses that to coordinate national and state and territory.
Spending a lot of money, you want to spend more money on housing, now $1 billion buying off state by state, it's going to get pretty expensive and locked in annual expenditure.
Well, not that expensive compared to the $30 billion a year on the stage 3 tax cuts or the $12 billion this government will spend this year in tax
I mean, tax cuts are one of these things where you've got a thing called inflation and bracket creep. So you actually, even on the top tier, they haven't had a tax cut since 2007.
I do not think that people earning over $200,000 a year need a tax cut right now. And
do they ever need one?
I certainly don't think.
Do they ever need one? There hasn't been one since 2006 or 2007.
In the short to medium, look, I don't think so. Look,
Never.
I'm on a good salary now, and I can guarantee you I do not need a tax cut, nor do any of the politicians in this place extra $9,000 a year. And I think this is fundamentally, though, a question of priorities. Right. In a wealthy country like this, I think we can afford to spend a bit more to tackle the housing.
Max Chandler-Mather, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks.